For over 2 decades, the theatrical cuts of the wizarding world have dictated global pop culture, shaping the collective memory of an entire generation. But beneath the flashing cinematic special effects and the grand orchestral scores lies a massive corporate web of narrative cover-ups, omitted plot histories, and systematic character executions. Welcome to the Potter Audit. This platform does not exist to celebrate Hollywood hype, nor does it operate on casual movie nostalgia. This is an independent forensic review of the original literary text canon. As our systematic countdown to the winter production parameters narrows, our single objective is absolute factual reconstruction. We are dissecting the vital rules, dark philosophies, and gritty realities that Warner Bros. Was too afraid to film. The forensic files are officially open. The audit begins now. Unsealing this archive demands an immediate bypass of the carefully curated propaganda issued by the Department of Magical Law Enforcement regarding wartime finance. The mainstream historical ledger routinely presents the Bank of Gringotts as an unassailable neutral zone that remained fundamentally decoupled from state overreach during the 1997 coup. This bureaucratic framing remains an intentional distortion of the text. A forensic audit of the economic baseline reveals that the Goblin Nation operated under a fragile, highly compromised legal armistice that granted them operational autonomy over the subterranean vaults, while denying them basic legislative representation within the Wizengamot. This structural vulnerability left the entire banking infrastructure uniquely exposed to state-sponsored intervention. The puppet administration of pious thickness did not launch a chaotic, armed assault on the marble facade. Instead, the Death Eater network executed a highly coordinated, legalistic, corporate hostile takeover that turned a sovereign vault network into an absolute financial monopoly controlled directly by the ministry apparatus. This absolute monopoly, controlled directly by the ministry apparatus, was enforced through a highly specialized covert campaign of psychological enslavement targeting senior Goblin account managers. To bypass the formidable ancient physical protections of the lower vaults, including the thief's downfall and legendary draconic deterrents, the ministry utilized the clinical precision of the imperious curse. The text reveals that the state systematically placed high-ranking goblins under total mental subjugation, transforming the bank's internal gatekeepers into unwitting double agents for the regime. By overriding the cognitive autonomy of these key administrative assets, the ministry avoided triggering a catastrophic goblin strike or a full-scale physical rebellion. This administrative deployment demonstrates how the Dark Lord's regime preferred institutional capture over overt military destruction. The Goblin staff continued to perform their daily duties with glassy-eyed precision, masking a total systemic surrender under the guise of uninterrupted routine banking operations, proving that absolute tyranny operates most effectively when it leaves the existing bureaucracy completely intact. Leaving the existing bureaucracy completely intact allowed the ministry to rapidly deploy asset forfeiture as a primary weapon of political and racial persecution. Under the legislative cover of the Muggle-born Registration Commission, the state implemented sweeping tracking protocols that targeted the financial holdings of anyone declared illegal by the regime. The book Canon outlines a terrifying financial purge. When Muggle-born witches and wizards fled to avoid extrajudicial imprisonment in Azkaban, their Gringotts vaults were instantly frozen and their domestic assets seized by the state. This financial liquidation served a dual purpose, hollowing out the economic survival capacity of the underground resistance, while simultaneously rewarding loyal, pure-blood collaborators with confiscated capital. The ministry successfully turned an independent banking institution into an aggressive tool of population control, establishing an institutional precedent where any ideological deviation from the state could be penalized with immediate total economic erasure, a dark reality that the Hollywood films completely chose to ignore. This total economic erasure forced the underground resistance into initiating a desperate counter-offensive targeting the heavily fortified Lestrange vault. The literary text explicitly details that Gringotts was no longer just a depository for private aristocrats, but a high-security armory anchoring Voldemort's immortality project. When Harry, Ron and Hermione breached the subterranean levels in May of 1998, they were not committing a simple bank heist. They were engaging in an act of asymmetric warfare against a weaponized financial state. The book canon underscores the sheer technical difficulty of this operation, highlighting the presence of the thief's downfall, a waterfall engineered to wash away all magical concealment. The cinematic version reduced this sequence to a fast-paced action set piece, bypassing the profound thematic weight of the moment. The original text presents the infiltration as a grim, suffocating descent into an industrial fortress where the line between state enforcement and corporate asset management had completely dissolved. The dissolved boundaries of this state-controlled fortress are most viscerally personified by the biological degradation of the blind dragon guarding the deepest vaults. The original book text presents a horrifying case study in institutional animal cruelty that the movies heavily romanticized. The canon details that this massive creature had spent its entire life underground, its eyes milky and blind from perpetual darkness, its scales pale and flaky from malnutrition, and its hind legs permanently scarred by heavy iron constraints. Gringotts did not view the dragon as a sacred, magical beast, but as a depreciating security asset to be systematically broken through conditioned pain. The guards utilized clankers, metal instruments that made a loud, rhythmic noise, to terrify the beast into submission, exploiting its auditory trauma to control access to the elite pure-blood wealth. This clinical weaponization of an animal's suffering exposes the underlying moral bankruptcy of the entire wizarding economic system, proving that the accumulation of private gold depended directly on institutionalized torment. This absolute destruction intensified upon entry into the Lestrange vault, which triggered a series of aggressive defensive spells designed to incinerate any unauthorized intruder. The book canon outlines the lethal efficiency of the Geminio and Flagranti curses, which caused every object touched to multiply infinitely while burning at white-hot temperatures. The text describes a terrifying, claustrophobic environment where the gold itself becomes a predatory swelling tide of liquid fire. Harry and his companions were nearly suffocated by an exponential explosion of burning metal, a sequence that highlights the psychopathic nature of pure-blood asset protection. The aristocracy did not merely lock their wealth away. They engineered their repositories to execute anyone who threatened their hoarded capital, prioritizing the preservation of material treasure over human life. This economic dark magic matrix reveals that the elite classes viewed their gold as an extension of their baseline sovereignty, creating a defensive architecture that would happily incinerate the world before surrendering a single galleon. The desperate preservation of that hoarded capital directly inflamed the deep-seated animosity defining the historical goblin-wizard split. The text in the Deathly Hallows uses the goblin grip hook to articulate a profound, systemic critique of wizarding property law. Griphook explicitly states that the goblin nation views ownership as a matter of creation, not purchase. To a goblin, any object forged by their hands belongs inherently to the maker, and the wizarding practice of passing goblin-made artifacts through human inheritance is viewed as state-sanctioned theft. The ministry's corporate takeover of the bank brought this ideological Cold War to a boiling point. By deploying Death Eaters to systematically manage goblin accounts, the wizarding government shattered the last remnants of the banking treaty. This regulatory betrayal proved to the goblin nation that the human ruling class would always manipulate the legal framework to ensure their ultimate economic dominance, rendering any promise of shared financial stewardship completely hollow. This systemic betrayal culminated in the total destruction of the banking floor during the spectacular breakout of the captive dragon. While the film version celebrated this escape as a triumphant moment of rebellion, the original literary text details the immediate catastrophic institutional fallout of the event. The breakout shattered the myth of Gringotts' absolute security, sending shockwaves through the entire national economy. The ministry responded not by investigating the security failures, but by executing immediate narrative control, executing several senior goblin tellers who had witnessed the breach to hide the vulnerability of the state's financial heart. The book canon reveals that Voldemort personally slaughtered the bank's remaining administrative staff in a fit of rage upon learning of the Horcrux theft. This bloody purge highlights the terrifying reality of a state-controlled economy. When the financial infrastructure fails to protect the regime's private assets, the government will happily liquidate the bankers to maintain the illusion of absolute control. This bloody liquidation of the administrative staff was entirely systematically omitted by the corporate production pipelines of Warner Brothers. In director David Yates's theatrical translation of The Deathly Hallows Part 2, the complex financial warfare defining the Goblin Ministry conflict was completely excised to preserve a fast-paced action narrative. Hollywood production records reveal that scriptwriter Steve Kloves had to compress a massive, dense book into a manageable theatrical runtime, reducing the hostile takeover of Gringotts to a few aesthetic changes featuring dark banners and grim guards. By presenting the bank primarily as a visual obstacle for a dramatic dragon breakout, the movies completely obscured the deeper corporate critique of state-sanctioned asset seizure. This choice shielded global theatre audiences from the uncomfortable political realism of the source text, compressing a sophisticated commentary on institutional corruption into a conventional, family-friendly fantasy blockbuster franchise that prioritized spectacle over structural depth. The lingering consequence of this corporate mitigation is a global audience completely blind to how the Ministry of Magic uses regulatory warfare to anchor its totalitarian control over private capital. The book canon demands we recognize that the true danger of the Gringotts takeover was never restricted to the physical infiltration of its deep vaults, but lay in the complete capture of the state's financial machinery by a radical regime. The Gringotts file stands as an undeniable forensic proof of a society where private property, banking autonomy, and institutional treaties can be completely subverted by an executive branch determined to enforce its absolute supremacy. As the production parameters for the 2026 television adaptation materialize, the creative staff faces a monumental opportunity to finally reject the softened Hollywood filters of the past, restoring the raw economic horror of this banking Cold War. The forensic truth remains locked in the text, awaiting a reconstruction that refuses to look away from the corruption hiding directly behind the state seal. The forensic files for this specific case study are officially closed, but our systematic countdown to the winter launch continues to accelerate. The historical text canon holds thousands of hidden secrets, structural plot holes, and corporate alterations that must be brought into the light before the cameras roll. To secure your administrative clearance for our upcoming weekly intelligence briefings, tap the subscribe button on your screen right now. Ensure you explore our archive of daily shorts to trace the complete, unbroken timeline of movie alterations. Do not let Hollywood dictate the boundaries of your law. Stay vigilant. The audit never sleeps.